They made a critical mistake when they decided to mess with Jake Morrison. What started as an environmental protest on Interstate 40 became the day a 67-year-old trucker with 4 decades of road experience taught a group of college activists why you never block a highway when someone's livelihood depends on getting through. Jake Morrison has been driving 18-wheelers since 1982, back when CB radios were king and GPS was science fiction. A third-generation trucker whose grandfather hauled moonshine through Tennessee mountains and whose father transported everything from cattle to construction equipment across the American West. Jake owns his own rig, a pristine 2019 Peterbilt 389 with chrome that gleams like a mirror and an engine that purrs like a satisfied cat. But Jake isn't just any trucker. He's transporting a critical shipment of insulin and medical supplies to children's hospitals across 3 states, racing against time and temperature controls that could mean the difference between life and death for diabetic kids whose families are counting on this delivery. His refrigerated trailer maintains precise temperatures, and any delay beyond his calculated schedule could spoil medications worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, medications that can't be easily replaced. The chapter establishes Jake's character as a man of principle who spent his life navigating bureaucracy, bad weather, and worse drivers. He's seen protests before, but always found ways around them. Today, on this particular stretch of I-40 through Colorado, a group called Climate Future Now has chosen the worst possible time and place to make their statement. They've blocked all lanes of the interstate during peak shipping hours, trapping not just Jake, but dozens of other commercial vehicles carrying everything from fresh produce to auto parts. The protesters, led by 22-year-old environmental studies major Emma Hartwell and her faculty advisor Dr. Michael Chun, believe they're fighting for planetary survival. They've chosen this location specifically because it's a major shipping corridor, thinking that disrupting commerce will force media attention on climate change. What they don't understand is that some cargo can't wait for political statements, and some drivers won't be intimidated by college kids with signs. The chapter ends with Jake's CB radio crackling to life as other truckers report the blockade ahead, and his realization that his delivery window is rapidly closing while young protesters debate the planet's future in the middle of a federal highway. Emma Hartwell clutches her cardboard sign reading Climate Action Now as she stands in the center of Interstate 40, convinced that disrupting the flow of commerce is the only way to force society to confront the environmental crisis. Around her, nearly 200 protesters have created a human chain across all 4 lanes of the highway, effectively shutting down one of America's major shipping arteries. The protest has been weeks in the planning, organized through encrypted messaging apps and social media campaigns that promise direct action against climate destruction. Emma and her fellow activists from Colorado Environmental University have studied the tactics of previous protest movements, from the civil rights era to modern climate activism. They believe that strategic disruption is the only language that corporate America understands. Dr. Michael Chun, the 45-year-old environmental science professor who helped organize the demonstration, stands beside Emma with the confidence of someone whose academic theories are finally being put into practice. He's published papers on civil disobedience and social movements, and sees this highway blockade as a living laboratory for his research on effective protest tactics. The protesters have come prepared for a long occupation. They've brought supplies, portable toilets, and even a small solar-powered sound system that broadcasts speeches about carbon emissions and corporate responsibility. College students from 3 universities have joined the demonstration, along with environmental activists from across the region. They've coordinated with sympathetic media outlets to ensure coverage of their historic action for climate justice. Traffic begins backing up within minutes of the blockade's establishment. Cars, trucks, and commercial vehicles stretch for miles in both directions as drivers discover that the highway they depend on has been transformed into a political statement. Most passenger vehicle drivers can exit at nearby off-ramps and find alternate routes, adding time and frustration to their journeys, but not creating critical problems. The commercial truckers face a different reality. Interstate 40 is a vital shipping corridor connecting eastern and western markets. The The trucks backed up behind the protest carry time-sensitive cargo, fresh produce that will spoil, manufacturing components needed for assembly lines, and medical supplies with expiration dates. Each hour of delay costs thousands of dollars and disrupts supply chains that employ millions of Americans. Jake Morrison's voice crackles over the CB radio as truckers share information about the blockade. Breaker 19, this is Road Dog Jake. Anyone got eyes on how long this mess is going to last? Other drivers respond with frustration and growing anger as they realize the protesters aren't planning to move anytime soon. The Colorado State Police arrive within 30 minutes, but their initial response is cautious. The protesters have studied legal precedents and positioned themselves to claim First Amendment protections. They're technically on federal property, which complicates jurisdiction. The lead officer, Captain Maria Rodriguez, attempts to negotiate with protest leaders while calling for backup and try to establish emergency vehicle corridors. Emma Hartwell speaks for the protesters, her voice carried by the solar-powered amplifier as she addresses both the police and the growing crowd of stranded motorists. "We're here because our planet is dying," she declares, her words echoing off the canyon walls that frame this section of highway. "Every day we delay action on climate change. We steal the future from our children. A few hours of inconvenience today could save the world tomorrow." Her speech draws mixed reactions. Some stranded drivers honk in support, rolling down windows to shout encouragement. Others lean on their horns in frustration, creating a cacophony that adds to the tension. The truckers, monitoring the situation on their CB radios, are less sympathetic. They understand schedules, contracts, and the real-world consequences of delayed deliveries in ways that college students might not fully grasp. As the afternoon progresses, the protest takes on a festival atmosphere. Food trucks arrive to serve the demonstrators. Musicians appear with guitars and drums. Social media posts spread the word about the historic climate action taking place on I-40, drawing more supporters to the scene. Local news crews set up cameras to broadcast live coverage of the demonstration. But the longer the blockade continues, the more serious the consequences become. Emergency vehicles struggle to navigate the blocked highway. Medical helicopters hover overhead, looking for places to land. The economic impact grows by the hour as shipping companies scramble to reroute deliveries and manufacturing plants face potential shutdowns due to missing components. Jake Morrison sits in his cab, watching the temperature gauge on his refrigerated trailer and calculating how much time he has before his medical cargo begins to spoil. His logbook shows delivery deadlines that are becoming increasingly impossible to meet. Other truckers share similar concerns over the CB radio: fresh food spoiling, manufacturing deadlines missed, and livelihoods threatened by a protest that shows no signs of ending. The chapter ends with Emma Hartwell announcing through the amplifier that the protesters are prepared to occupy the highway for as long as it takes to force action on climate change, while Jake Morrison studies his route maps and begins calculating whether his 40 years of driving experience can find a solution that the authorities seem unable or unwilling to provide. Jake Morrison sits in the cab of his Peterbilt, studying the digital display that monitors his refrigerated trailer's internal temperature. The insulin and medical supplies he's carrying must remain between 36 and 46 degrees Fahrenheit, and any deviation outside that range for more than 2 hours could render the entire shipment worthless. His delivery schedule, calculated down to the minute, allowed for normal traffic delays, but not for a highway blockade with no end in sight. The CB radio crackles with increasingly frustrated voices as truckers share information about the protest. "Iron Eagle to Road Dog Jake. How much time you got on that reefer load?" asks Bill Patterson, a driver Jake has known for 15 years who's hauling fresh produce 2 trucks behind him. "Maybe 6 hours before things start getting dicey," Jake responds, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understands the real-world consequences of delay. "Got diabetic kids in Denver and Phoenix counting on this delivery. Their hospitals are already running low on supplies." Jake's cargo represents more than just a business transaction. Each vial of insulin in his trailer could mean the difference between life and death for children whose families depend on reliable medical supply chains. He's carried similar loads dozens of times, always aware that his professional responsibility extends beyond simply moving freight from point A to point B. He's a crucial link in a healthcare system that can't afford failures. The protest organizers seem oblivious to these realities. From his elevated position in the truck cab, Jake can see Emma Hartwell and Dr. Chun setting up what appears to be a semi-permanent encampment in the middle of the highway. They've brought camping gear, solar panels, and enough supplies to sustain their demonstration for days if necessary. Their commitment to their cause is admirable, but their understanding of the collateral damage is dangerously naive. Jake's phone buzzes with calls from dispatch, customers, and family members who've seen news coverage of the highway blockade. His wife, Sarah, calls from their home in Oklahoma, her voice tight with concern. "Jake, honey, the news is saying those protesters might be out there for days. What are you going to do?" "Still figuring that out," Jake admits, watching state police officers attempt to negotiate with protest leaders. "But I've got kids depending on this medicine, and I'm not going to let them down because some college students want to save the world by blocking a highway." Other truckers face similar pressures. Mickey Rodriguez, driving a load of auto parts needed for a manufacturing plant in New Mexico, reports that his delay could shut down an assembly line and send hundreds of workers home without pay. Linda Washington, hauling fresh produce from California farms, watches her cargo literally rot while protesters debate climate policy. Each delayed truck represents a ripple effect of economic disruption that the demonstrators either don't understand or don't care about. The authorities' response frustrates Jake more than the protesters themselves. Captain Rodriguez and her state police officers are clearly sympathetic to the trucker situation, but they're constrained by policies that prioritize avoiding confrontation over maintaining commerce. The protesters know this, which is why they've chosen civil disobedience as their tactic. They're betting that law enforcement will hesitate to forcibly remove peaceful demonstrators, even if those demonstrators are breaking federal laws by blocking an interstate highway. Jake studies his atlas, looking for alternate routes that might bypass the blockade. The problem is that Interstate 40 through this section of Colorado runs through a narrow canyon with limited alternatives. The few side roads are unsuitable for large trucks, either too steep, too narrow, or simply leading nowhere useful. The protesters have chosen their location strategically, knowing that their blockade would be nearly impossible to circumvent. As the afternoon wears on, Jake makes a series of phone calls that reveal the full scope of the problem his delayed delivery will create. The Children's Hospital in Denver reports that their insulin supplies are critically low, with enough medication for perhaps 48 hours of normal usage. The pediatric clinic in Phoenix faces a similar shortage. Both facilities are trying to source emergency supplies from other distributors, but the specialized medications Jake carries aren't easily replaced. Dr. Amanda Foster, the pediatric endocrinologist at Denver Children's Hospital, explains the situation when Jake calls her directly. "Captain Morrison, we have 37 children who depend on the specific insulin formulations you're carrying. These aren't medications we can substitute easily. If your delivery is delayed beyond tomorrow morning, we'll have to start rationing treatments and possibly transferring some of our sickest patients to facilities in other states." The weight of responsibility settles on Jake's shoulders like a familiar burden. He's carried critical medical supplies before, but never with such a visible and preventable obstacle blocking his path. The protesters' signs about saving the planet ring hollow when weighed against the immediate needs of sick children whose families trust the medical supply chain to function reliably. Jake's 40 years of trucking experience have taught him that sometimes the official channels fail, and drivers have to make their own decisions about how to get critical cargo delivered. He's navigated blizzards, floods, and equipment failures through persistence and creative problem-solving. Today's challenge is different, but not necessarily more difficult than others he's overcome. He begins formulating a plan that his years of experience and knowledge of trucking regulations suggest might be legally defensible, even if it's not conventionally approved. The key is demonstrating that his cargo constitutes a genuine emergency that justifies extraordinary measures. The insulin delivery documentation, hospital communications, and time-sensitive nature of the medical supplies could provide legal cover for actions that might otherwise be considered reckless or illegal. Other truckers noticed Jake's thoughtful silence on the CB radio and begin asking for his assessment of the situation. His reputation among drivers as someone who finds solutions to impossible problems makes his opinion valuable in their community. Jake's response reveals his growing determination. Breaker 19, this is Road Dog Jake. I'm studying the situation, but I've got sick kids depending on this medicine, and I'm running out of time to wait for the authorities to solve this problem for us. The chapter ends with Jake making a decision that will define not only his career, but also his legacy as a trucker who refused to let bureaucracy and protest prevent him from delivering life-saving medication to children who need it. Jake Morrison spreads his road atlas across the Peterbilt's dashboard, using a magnifying glass to study every detail of the terrain surrounding the blocked highway. 40 years of trucking have taught him that there's always another way through, even when the obvious path is blocked. The key is understanding the landscape, regulations, and the precise legal boundaries of what constitutes reasonable action in an emergency situation. His first call is to Tom Bradley, a fellow trucker who works as a driver trainer and knows federal transportation regulations better than most lawyers. Tom, I need you to walk me through the emergency exceptions for commercial vehicle operations, Jake says, his voice carrying the focused intensity of someone planning a complex operation. Jake, you're talking about the provisions that allow drivers to deviate from normal regulations when lives are at stake, Tom responds, clearly understanding the situation from news coverage. You need to document the emergency, show that standard channels have been exhausted, and prove that your cargo is genuinely critical. It's risky, but it's been done before. Jake's plan begins to take shape as he reviews the documentation for his insulin shipment. The medical necessity is clear and well documented. The hospitals have confirmed their critical need. The time sensitivity is established by the temperature requirements and expiration dates. The failed response by authorities to clear the highway creates the emergency conditions that might justify extraordinary measures. The terrain around the blocked highway offers a potential solution that only an experienced trucker would recognize. About 2 miles back from the protest site, a service road branches off toward a mountain pass that eventually reconnects with Interstate 40 beyond the blockade. The road was built for Forest Service access and occasional mining operations, but Jake's research suggests it might be capable of handling a large truck if driven carefully by someone with the necessary skills. Jake contacts the U.S. Forest Service to inquire about the service road's current condition and legal access restrictions. The ranger he speaks with, Jennifer Walsh, explains that the road is technically open to commercial traffic with proper permits, but it's rarely used by large trucks due to its challenging grades and narrow sections. The road was built to handle heavy equipment for fire suppression and mining operations, Walsh explains. It's steep and winding, but it's engineered for substantial loads. You need to drive slowly and carefully, but an experienced driver with a properly maintained vehicle could probably make it through. The legal framework for Jake's plan relies on federal transportation regulations that allow commercial drivers to deviate from normal operating procedures when responding to genuine emergencies. The key is proving that standard channels have been exhausted and that the cargo's importance justifies the risk. Jake's documentation of the medical emergency, combined with the authorities' apparent inability to clear the highway, creates the foundation for a legally defensible emergency response. Jake begins preparing his truck for the challenging mountain route. He checks tire pressure, tests his brakes, and ensures that his trailer's weight distribution is optimal for steep grades and tight turns. His Peterbilt's engine and transmission are well-maintained and capable of handling the demanding conditions, but the narrow margins for error require careful preparation. The CB radio network becomes Jake's intelligence gathering system as other truckers share information about road conditions, weather, and the continuing blockade. Several drivers offer to follow Jake's route if he successfully pioneers a path around the protesters, creating the potential for a convoy of commercial vehicles to bypass the demonstration entirely. Iron Eagle to Road Dog Jake. Bill Patterson calls over the radio. If you're thinking what I think you're thinking, you've got company. Half the drivers out here are ready to follow your lead if you can find a way through. Jake's conversation with the hospital in Denver adds urgency to his planning. Dr. Foster reports that 2 diabetic children have been admitted with blood sugar complications, and the hospital's insulin reserves are being depleted faster than anticipated. Captain Morrison, we need that shipment by tomorrow morning at the latest. After that, we're looking at potential medical emergencies that could have been prevented. The moral weight of the decision crystallizes for Jake. The protesters have the right to express their views, but their methods are creating immediate harm to vulnerable children who have no involvement in the political debate. The authorities' inability or unwillingness to balance protest rights with public safety has created a vacuum that someone needs to fill. Jake's plan includes communication protocols to ensure that his emergency response is documented and transparent. He contacts local law enforcement to inform them of his intended route and medical emergency justification. He calls his insurance company to verify coverage for emergency operations. He documents the hospital communications and time-sensitive nature of his cargo. Every step is designed to demonstrate that his actions are reasonable responses to a genuine emergency rather than vigilante enforcement of his personal preferences. The weather forecast adds another layer of complexity to Jake's decision. A storm system is approaching the region, with snow predicted for the mountain passes within the next 12 hours. If Jake is going to attempt the Forest Service Road, he needs to move soon before conditions deteriorate further. As Jake finalizes his preparations, other truckers begin positioning themselves to follow his route if he succeeds. The impromptu convoy forming behind his leadership represents more than just individual drivers trying to make their deliveries. It symbolizes the broader conflict between activist tactics that disrupt commerce and the economic realities that keep essential goods flowing to communities that depend on reliable transportation networks. Emma Hartwell and the protesters remain committed to their highway blockade, apparently unaware of or unconcerned about the medical emergency their demonstration is creating. Their social media posts celebrate the economic disruption they're causing, framing it as necessary sacrifice for climate action. The disconnect between their abstract ideals and the concrete harm to diabetic children illustrates the moral complexity of their chosen tactics. Jake's final preparation involves calling his wife Sarah to explain his plan and the risks involved. "Honey, I know this sounds crazy, but I've got kids who need this medicine, and I'm not going to let them suffer because some protesters think blocking a highway is going to save the planet." Sarah's response reflects the practical wisdom of someone married to a trucker for 32 years. "Jake Morrison, you be careful out there. But those kids are lucky to have someone like you fighting for them." The chapter ends with Jake starting his engine and beginning the careful process of backing away from the blocked highway toward the service road that represents his calculated gamble against both the protesters and the challenging mountain terrain that lies ahead. Jake Morrison guides his Peterbilt off Interstate 40 onto the narrow Forest Service Road, his experienced hands steady on the steering wheel as he begins the most challenging drive of his 4-decade career. The service road immediately slopes upward at a grade that would intimidate most truck drivers, but Jake's years of experience in mountainous terrain have prepared him for exactly this type of challenge. The road surface is rougher than modern highways, with patches of gravel and sections where recent weather has created washboard conditions that rattle the truck's cab. Jake maintains a steady speed of 15 miles per hour, balancing the need for progress against the risk of losing control on the unfamiliar terrain. His trailer's weight distribution becomes critical as the road begins winding through switchbacks that test both his driving skills and his equipment's capabilities. Behind him, 3 other trucks follow at careful intervals. Bill Patterson in his refrigerated produce hauler, Mickey Rodriguez with his auto parts delivery, and Linda Washington carrying fresh fruit that's already beginning to show signs of deterioration from the highway delay. Each driver maintains radio contact with Jake, relying on his experience to guide them through terrain none of them have navigated before. Road Dog Jake to Convoy. We're approaching a steep section with a sharp right turn at mile marker 7. Jake broadcasts over the CB radio. Take it slow and easy. The road surface is loose gravel here, and there's no guardrail. If you're not comfortable with the conditions, there's still time to turn back. None of the following drivers choose to retreat. Like Jake, they understand the importance of their cargo and the failure of official channels to resolve the highway blockade. Their decision to follow his lead represents a collective act of professional responsibility that prioritizes essential deliveries over regulatory compliance. The mountain route reveals spectacular scenery that would be breathtaking under different circumstances. Pine forests stretch as far as the eye can see, and distant peaks create a dramatic backdrop for their unconventional journey. But Jake's attention remains focused on the immediate challenges of navigating narrow turns and steep grades that push his truck's engine and brakes to their limits. Weather conditions begin deteriorating as the convoy climbs higher into the mountains. Light snow starts falling, creating slippery conditions that make the already challenging road even more dangerous. Jake's experience in winter driving becomes crucial as he adjusts his technique for the changing conditions, reducing speed further and allowing more distance between gear shifts. Iron Eagle to Road Dog Jake. Bill Patterson's voice crackles over the radio. How much farther do you think this road runs before we connect back to the highway? Jake consults his GPS and the Forest Service map he obtained from Ranger Walsh. According to my calculations, we should reach the highway connection in about 12 miles. The road levels out in another 3 miles. Then it's mostly downhill to the Interstate 40 interchange. The most challenging section of the route comes at mile marker 9, where the service road navigates a series of hairpin turns around a steep canyon. Jake's trailer overhangs the road surface on some of the tighter turns, requiring precise positioning to avoid getting stuck or sliding off the narrow roadway. His years of experience backing into difficult loading docks and navigating tight urban deliveries serve him well in threading the large truck through spaces barely adequate for the task. As news of Jake's mountain route spreads through the trucking community via CB radio and social media, other drivers trapped by the highway blockade begin considering whether to follow his example. The convoy behind Jake grows to 6 trucks, then 8, as more drivers conclude that the official channels aren't going to solve their delivery problems in time to meet their obligations. The protesters on Interstate 40 remain unaware of the developing convoy that's bypassing their blockade entirely. Their social media posts continue celebrating the economic disruption they're causing, apparently assuming that all commercial traffic has been successfully halted by their demonstration. Emma Hartwell posts updates about the historic direct action that's forcing attention on climate change, while Dr. Chun provides academic commentary about the effectiveness of economic pressure in creating social change. Jake's radio receives updates about the continuing standoff between protesters and authorities on the blocked highway. Captain Rodriguez and her state police officers are still attempting to negotiate a resolution, but the protesters remain committed to maintaining their blockade indefinitely. The disconnect between the official negotiations and Jake's practical solution illustrates the difference between bureaucratic processes and individual initiative in solving urgent problems. The mountain route's most dangerous moment comes when the convoy encounters a section of road damaged by recent weather. A washout has reduced the road to a single lane with a steep drop-off on one side and a rock wall on the other. Jake stops his truck and walks ahead to assess the conditions, using his flashlight to evaluate whether the remaining road surface can support the weight of loaded trucks. This is marginal, but I think we can make it if we go one at a time and stay as close to the inside as possible. Jake radios to the following drivers. If anyone's not comfortable with this section, now's the time to turn back. No shame in recognizing your limits. Again, none of the drivers choose to retreat. The shared commitment to completing their deliveries despite official obstacles has created a bond among the convoy members that transcends individual risk assessment. They trust Jake's judgment and their own abilities to navigate challenges that bureaucratic solutions have failed to address. Jake's successful navigation of the washout section demonstrates the value of experience and careful assessment in overcoming obstacles that might seem impossible to less experienced drivers. His methodical approach to evaluating risks and making calculated decisions reflects the professional expertise that the trucking industry depends on for reliable freight delivery. As the convoy begins its descent toward the Interstate 40 reconnection point, Jake's CB radio receives congratulations from other drivers who are monitoring the situation. Word of his successful mountain route is spreading through the trucking community, creating the potential for more drivers to follow his example if the highway blockade continues. The chapter ends with Jake's convoy emerging from the Forest Service Road onto Interstate 40, successfully bypassing the protesters' blockade and proving that individual initiative and professional expertise can overcome obstacles that official channels seem unable or unwilling to address. The sight of clear highway ahead represents not just progress toward their delivery destinations, but vindication of the principle that essential services must continue despite political demonstrations. As Jake Morrison's convoy emerges from the mountain route onto clear Interstate 40, the significance of their achievement becomes immediately apparent. They've successfully bypassed a blockade that has stranded hundreds of vehicles and frustrated law enforcement for hours. But more importantly, Jake's medical cargo is back on schedule for delivery to hospitals where diabetic children depend on the insulin he's carrying. The CB radio explodes with congratulations from truckers throughout the region who have been monitoring Jake's progress. "Road Dog Jake, you magnificent bastard, you actually did it," calls out Tommy Martinez, a driver stuck in the backup behind the protest. "How difficult was that mountain route? Can other trucks follow your path?" Jake's response is characteristically modest but informative. It's doable for experienced drivers with properly maintained equipment, but it's not a route for rookies or trucks with mechanical problems. The grades are steep, the turns are tight, and weather's moving in. Anyone thinking about following this route better move fast. Word of Jake's successful bypass spreads rapidly through social media and trucking networks. Videos filmed by following drivers show the convoy navigating challenging mountain terrain, providing visual proof that the protesters' blockade can be circumvented by drivers willing to take calculated risks and use alternative routes that most people would never consider. The reaction from the block protesters is swift and revealing. Emma Hartwell posts angry updates on social media, denouncing Jake and his convoy as selfish capitalists who prioritize profits over planetary survival. Her response reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. Jake isn't transporting luxury goods or optional merchandise, but life-saving medication for children whose families have no political involvement in the climate debate. Dr. Chin's academic response is more measured but equally tone-deaf to the medical emergency Jake is addressing. He posts a lengthy analysis of how corporate transportation networks use emotional manipulation to undermine environmental activism, completely ignoring the fact that the insulin Jake carries has nothing to do with corporate profits and everything to do with keeping diabetic children alive. The media coverage of Jake's mountain route creates a narrative conflict that the protesters hadn't anticipated. Instead of universal sympathy for their environmental message, public opinion begins dividing between those who support their right to protest and those who question tactics that potentially harm vulnerable people who have no involvement in climate policy debates. Local news stations interview Jake via radio as he continues toward Denver. His explanation of the medical emergency, his delayed delivery, provides a human face for the collateral damage of highway blockades. "I've got nothing against people wanting to save the environment," Jake explains to the interviewer. "But when your protest methods prevent life-saving medication from reaching sick kids, maybe you need to think about whether you're really helping anyone." The success of Jake's bypass route encourages other trapped drivers to attempt similar solutions. Within hours, a dozen more trucks have followed the mountain route, creating an informal convoy system that effectively negates the economic impact of the highway blockade. The protesters' strategy of disrupting commerce by blocking a major highway is undermined by the resourcefulness and determination of drivers who refuse to accept that demonstration as an insurmountable obstacle. Captain Rodriguez and her state police officers find themselves in an awkward position as Jake's convoy proves that the protesters' blockade can be bypassed entirely. The official negotiations with demonstration leaders become less urgent when commercial traffic develops its own solutions to the blocked highway. The authorities' inability to balance protest rights with commerce is highlighted by private citizens taking initiative that official channels couldn't provide. Jake's call to Denver Children's Hospital provides a moment of genuine emotion in an otherwise technical story about logistics and regulations. Dr. Foster's relief is audible when Jake confirms that his delivery will arrive on schedule despite the highway blockade. Captain Morrison, I can't adequately express how important this is. We have children whose lives literally depend on the medications you're carrying. The conversation reveals the human cost of protest tactics that treat economic disruption as an abstract political tool. The diabetic children in Denver's hospital aren't corporate executives or climate change deniers. They're vulnerable patients whose medical needs exist independently of environmental policy debates. Jake's determination to complete his delivery despite official obstacles represents a form of public service that transcends political categories. Other drivers in Jake's convoy begin sharing their own stories of critical cargo that the highway blockade threatened to delay. Mickey Rodriguez explains that his auto parts delivery is needed to prevent a manufacturing plant shutdown that would send 300 workers home without pay. Linda Washington describes how her fresh produce shipment feeds school lunch programs for low-income children who depend on reliable nutrition. The protesters' social media response to these stories reveals the ideological rigidity that makes compromise impossible. Rather than acknowledging the human costs of their blockade, they double down on claims that environmental destruction justifies any tactical necessary to force policy changes. Emma Hartwell posts that short-term inconvenience is nothing compared to the long-term catastrophe of climate change, apparently unable to recognize that sick children needing medication aren't experiencing inconvenience but genuine medical emergencies. Jake's successful mountain route becomes a symbol for broader questions about civil disobedience, emergency services, and the balance between protest rights and public welfare. Conservative media outlets celebrate him as a hero who refused to let political demonstrations prevent him from serving vulnerable children. Progressive outlets focus on the environmental message of the protesters while downplaying the medical consequences of their tactics. The legal implications of Jake's bypass route create interesting questions about emergency transportation exceptions and civil disobedience responses. His documentation of the medical emergency, communication with authorities, and careful adherence to safety protocols provide a model for how commercial drivers might legally respond to future highway blockades that threaten critical deliveries. As Jake's convoy approaches Denver, the contrast between official paralysis and individual initiative becomes stark. While law enforcement and protest organizers continue their standoff on the blocked highway, Jake's practical solution has already delivered the medical supplies that children needed. His success proves that bureaucratic processes aren't the only way to solve urgent problems. The chapter ends with Jake's arrival at Denver Children's Hospital, where medical staff wait to receive the insulin shipment that will prevent potentially life-threatening medication shortages. The sight of the Peterbilt pulling into the hospital loading dock represents more than just a successful delivery. It symbolizes the triumph of individual responsibility over institutional failure and the importance of essential services that must continue despite political disruptions. The story of Jake Morrison's mountain route bypass explodes across social media and national news outlets within hours of his successful delivery to Denver Children's Hospital. Video footage of his convoy navigating challenging terrain creates a compelling visual narrative that captures public imagination in ways that abstract policy debates never could. The image of a lone trucker refusing to let protesters prevent him from delivering life-saving medication to children resonates with viewers across political divisions. CNN's transportation correspondent files a live report from the hospital loading dock as Jake unloads his insulin shipment. What we're witnessing here is the real-world consequence of highway blockades, she explains to viewers. While protesters and police negotiate on Interstate 40, this truck driver took initiative to ensure that diabetic children wouldn't suffer because of a political demonstration. Fox News takes a different angle, interviewing Jake via phone as he prepares for his next delivery stop in Phoenix. Their coverage emphasizes the failure of authorities to maintain essential commerce and Jake's individual heroism in overcoming bureaucratic paralysis. "This is what American ingenuity looks like," the anchor declares. One man with 4 decades of experience finding solutions that government couldn't provide. The competing narratives create a media firestorm that transforms Jake from an anonymous truck driver into a national symbol for different political viewpoints. Conservative outlets celebrate him as proof that individual initiative trumps government regulation and protest disruption. Progressive media struggles to balance sympathy for environmental activism with the undeniable reality that Jake's cargo served vulnerable children who needed medical care. Emma Hartwell and Dr. Chen find themselves on the defensive as public opinion shifts against their highway blockade tactics. Their scheduled interview on MSNBC becomes an uncomfortable examination of whether their methods created genuine harm to innocent people. The children who needed that insulin didn't choose to be part of your protest, the interviewer points out. How do you justify tactics that potentially endanger their lives? Emma's response reveals the ideological bubble that prevented her from considering the medical consequences of her demonstration. Climate change kills children every day through heat waves, floods, and air pollution, she argues. We can't let isolated cases distract us from the bigger picture of planetary survival. The isolated cases she dismisses include 37 diabetic children whose hospital was running critically low on insulin. But her framing illustrates how abstract environmental activism can lose sight of immediate human needs. Dr. Chun provides academic backing for her position, citing studies about civil disobedience effectiveness while carefully avoiding discussion of the specific medical emergency their blockade created. Social media reactions split along predictable political lines, but with interesting cross-currents that complicate simple partisan narratives. Many environmental activists criticize the highway blockade as counterproductive, arguing that tactics which harm vulnerable people undermine public support for climate action. Conservative commentators who typically oppose trucking unions find themselves celebrating Jake's individual heroism while carefully avoiding broader discussions of worker rights. The trucking industry's response to Jake's mountain route is unanimously supportive, with trade publications and driver organizations hailing his initiative as exemplary professionalism under extraordinary circumstances. The Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association issues a statement praising Jake's dedication to essential services and public safety in the face of unreasonable obstacles. Jake's wife, Sarah, finds herself fielding interview requests from media outlets across the country, all wanting to understand the man behind the viral story. Her responses provide insight into the personal values that motivated Jake's decision to bypass the blockade. Jake has always believed that if you make a commitment, you honor it, she explains to a reporter. Those children needed their medicine, and he wasn't going to let politics get in the way of that. The hospital staff's testimonials add emotional weight to Jake's story. Dr. Foster provides specific details about how the delayed insulin shipment could have created medical emergencies for diabetic children. Captain Morrison didn't just deliver medication, she tells reporters. He prevented potential hospitalizations and complications that could have had lasting effects on these children's health. Competing protest groups begin taking sides in the public debate. Environmental organizations distance themselves from highway blockade tactics, with some issuing statements supporting climate action while opposing methods that endanger public health. Other activist groups defend the Interstate 40 demonstration as necessary disruption that forces attention on urgent environmental issues. The legal community watches Jake's case with interest, as his emergency bypass route raises questions about civil disobedience, transportation regulations, and individual responsibility when official systems fail. Law schools begin using his situation as a case study in competing legal principles and emergency response protocols. Corporate responses to the media coverage reveal the economic interests at stake in highway protest tactics. Shipping companies issue statements supporting Jake while calling for stronger legal protections for essential commerce. Pharmaceutical manufacturers emphasize the critical nature of medical supply chains that can't tolerate unpredictable disruptions. The chapter ends with Jake's arrival in Phoenix, where another children's hospital waits for his delivery, and where local media crews have gathered to document the completion of his mission that began with a blocked highway and a determination to serve the most vulnerable members of society. Jake Morrison's successful mountain route creates a ripple effect throughout the trucking industry as drivers trapped by similar protests begin adopting his model of documented emergency response and alternative routing. Within days of his Denver delivery, copycat situations emerge across the country where commercial drivers use Jake's precedent to justify bypassing highway blockades that threaten time-sensitive cargo. In Oregon, a convoy of lumber trucks uses Forest Service roads to circumvent environmental protesters blocking Interstate 5. The drivers document their deliveries to construction sites where delays would idle hundreds of workers, following Jake's model of establishing emergency justification before deviating from standard routes. Their success proves that Jake's tactics can be replicated by drivers with appropriate documentation and emergency circumstances. The phenomenon spreads to other types of protests beyond environmental demonstrations. When labor activists block access to a shipping port in California, truck drivers carrying medical supplies and perishable goods coordinate alternative routes through industrial areas that bypass the demonstration entirely. Their actions create new precedents for balancing protest rights with essential commerce. Emma Hartwell and the original Interstate 40 protesters find their demonstration increasingly isolated as commercial traffic develops systematic workarounds for their blockade. The economic pressure they hope to create through highway disruption is neutralized by drivers who refuse to accept protest tactics as insurmountable obstacles. Their social media posts reveal growing frustration with the failure of their strategy to achieve intended results. Federal transportation officials begin studying Jake's emergency response model to develop formal guidelines for commercial drivers facing similar situations. The Department of Transportation recognizes that highway protests have become a recurring challenge that requires systematic solutions rather than ad hoc responses by individual drivers. Law enforcement agencies across the country receive training on Jake's case as an example of how private citizens can legally respond to civil disobedience when official channels prove inadequate. Police departments develop protocols for assisting commercial drivers who document genuine emergencies and seek official support for alternative routing. The Interstate 40 blockade continues for 3 more days, but its effectiveness diminishes as more drivers follow Jake's example of finding alternative solutions. The protesters' strategy of economic disruption fails when targeted businesses develop resilience against demonstration tactics. Emma Hartwell's movement becomes a case study in how rigid ideology can blind activists to the adaptive capacity of the systems they're trying to disrupt. Jake's phone interviews with trucking industry publications create a template for other drivers facing similar challenges. His emphasis on documentation, communication with authorities, and genuine emergency circumstances provides a legal framework that transforms individual initiative into systematic industry response to protest disruptions. The success of alternative routing strategies forces environmental groups to reconsider highway blockade tactics that can be easily circumvented by experienced drivers. Some organizations shift toward protest methods that can't be bypassed through individual initiative, while others abandon disruptive tactics entirely in favor of conventional political lobbying. Corporate logistics departments begin incorporating protest contingency plans into their shipping strategies, recognizing that highway demonstrations have become predictable obstacles requiring systematic responses. Jake's mountain route becomes the foundation for training programs that teach drivers how to legally navigate around civil disobedience while maintaining essential services. The chapter explores how Jake's individual act of professional responsibility evolves into an industry-wide movement that changes the balance of power between protesters and commercial transportation. His refusal to let political demonstrations prevent him from serving vulnerable children creates a model that other drivers adapt to their own circumstances and cargo requirements. The success of Jake Morrison's bypass route and its copycat applications prompt legal challenges from protest experience, titled The Right Route: How One Trucker Changed America's Approach to Essential Services. The book becomes required reading in professional ethics courses and public administration programs across the country. The Supreme Court cites the Morrison precedent in subsequent decisions involving the balance between individual rights and collective responsibilities, establishing Jake's case as foundational law that extends beyond transportation into broader questions of emergency response and professional duty. Jake's hometown in Oklahoma dedicates a section of their public library to transportation history and constitutional law, featuring his story as an example of how ordinary citizens can create extraordinary change through professional dedication and moral courage. 10 years later, Jake retires from over-the-road trucking but continues working as a consultant for emergency transportation systems. His legacy includes not only the legal precedent that bears his name, but also the thousands of drivers who learned that professional responsibility sometimes requires going beyond official procedures to serve the most vulnerable members of society. The final scene shows Jake training a new class of drivers in Morrison standard procedures, explaining that their professional licenses carry responsibilities that extend beyond simply moving cargo from one location to another. When you're carrying medicine that sick kids need, he tells them, you find a way to get it delivered, no matter what obstacles get put in your path. His students include drivers from diverse backgrounds who share Jake's commitment to essential services and professional excellence. Among them is Maria Santos, a young woman whose own diabetic daughter benefited from reliable medical supply deliveries that the Morrison Standard helps protect. As Jake concludes the training session, his CB radio crackles with reports from drivers across the country who continue following the precedent he established on a mountain road in Colorado. Their voices represent thousands of professionals who understand that some cargo transcends politics, and some responsibilities require individual courage when official systems fail. The story ends with Jake climbing into his Peterbilt for one more delivery run, his truck equipped with modern technology, but carrying the same sense of professional duty that motivated his original mountain route. The road ahead stretches toward communities that depend on reliable transportation, and Jake Morrison continues driving toward people who need what he's carrying, knowing that his legacy ensures other drivers will always find a way through.